Hey everybody, my name is Onepeg, and in today's video we're going to talk about all things related to Dark and Darker's upcoming playtest on the 16th of December. So we have about 7 days before the playtest comes down, and I had an opportunity to sit down with Terry, the CEO of Iron Mace Games, creator of Dark and Darker, yesterday, where we talked for about an hour and 15 minutes about what we can expect in the upcoming playtest. This is going to be a thing that we do from, I don't know, the last video on through until the game releases, where we talk about a week ahead of time of the patch, what we can expect, what's changed, what they learned, and what we as gamers are going to likely end up experiencing. But let me tell you, there is a lot here. The extra time that they had given themselves between the last playtest in October and now has seemed to generate an awful lot more content and updates and changes to the game in a very interesting and very good way. So while these videos I try to make as short as possible because it was an hour and 15 minutes of basically just bangers the entire time that I talked to Terry, there's going to be a lot to unpack here. So this is a summary, but it's probably going to run a little bit longer than stuff that you're used to seeing from me. So just be forewarned. If you're looking for a TLDR summary, if there is something that I can give you that is short and sweet so that you guys can go on about your day and you don't want to hear about all the new and interesting things, because again, there's a lot of them and I would stick around if I were you. The TLDR is there's a focus more so this time around on solo queues and game flow. There is not going to be a solo only queue, but there is some better spawning that is going on for the players that play the game. The maps have been expanded, although the number of map variances has been reduced, and there's a whole lot more spells being added in a brand new magic system. Oh, and high roller dungeons. Now, for those of you that want to know what all that means, we'll get into it. As I said at the start, the focus for this patch seems to have been more about map flow and the ability for players to be able to navigate the map in a way where combat was more avoidable, giving people exit routes and what Terry referred to as pathways in between these modules. See, the map is made up of different modular chunks. So each large room is its own building block, kind of like a big Lego. And these building blocks are assembled in a certain order, kind of like a grid system. Through the last playtest, this grid system was 3 4x4 maps for the level that we began on, which is level 2. There is going to be a level 1 that they're going to introduce at some point down the road, but we're not there yet. Instead, what we're doing is we're being dropped in on the second level and then going down to level 3, which is hell difficulty. So this level 2 had 3 variances of map. There were the 2 that we were kind of accustomed to that were a little bit more grid system based, and then a third one which I started referring to as the wheel, the one that had the large center circular room in the middle, and then there were these rooms that kind of came off of the sides of it like spokes. That has since been changed. The grid for each of those 3 maps that we had to play on the last time was a 4x4 grid, give or take. This time around, there's going to be 2 maps, and they are going to be 5x5, so a bit larger than what we had seen previously. The time duration for those maps, I am going to assume, will be about the same, at least at the start. Perhaps it will be modified later, as well as the portal counts are potentially being adjusted during the course of our gameplay cycle. This is going to last a week. It's going to run from the 16th to the 21st, just in time for Christmas, of course, until they end up extending it a couple more days, which I ended up joking with Terry about, but I digress. So while there isn't a heavy focus on the ability for players to solo queue, and let me reiterate this, Terry, I asked this specifically, he said that the solo queue, so that only solos play against other solos, is not going to be something that they look into doing until they've exhausted every other possible option, meaning that they don't want that to end up being the default. They're going to try to space out spawns a bit better, allow for people to have more maneuverability between these different modules that make up these maps, and they introduced, again, these new pathways. So there's going to be the ability to circumvent having to fight the monsters in most all of these different rooms so that you can bypass certain pieces of this deadly content if you want or need to, either in an escape or because you need a little bit of downtime to be able to heal up or meditate if you're a wizard, for instance. instance, those kinds of things. So the spawns have been adjusted, and the flow of the maps have been improved according to them. He said specifically when it came to how the map was being played internally, they had been focusing more on like 2- and 3-man parties running around on the map fighting each other, and when they were doing their internal testing. This time he said it was half 2- and 3-man parties, and the other half of the people that were queuing up in these 16-man lobbies were solo players in the studio. For this week, he said there's going to be a large focus on that gameplay flow to work toward when the game test begins. Insofar as the wheel map, that is going to be omitted from this playtest. While there were aspects of the map that made sense, like being able to jump down to the lower level and hide in the dark, for instance, between the outer spokes and the center of the wheel, it enabled players that were ranged-based, specifically rangers, to be able to just snipe the lights out. The way that Terry put it was, if you were somebody that was really good at FPS games and you were a veteran of games like Tarkov, you were pretty much dominating the map as soon as you got to the middle because you just sniped everyone as they moved around. So it's possible we won't see the wheel come back, at least not in its current state, unless they potentially are able to do some more balancing. But what Terry did like about this was the verticality. See, in the wheel map, there was more vertical gameplay with the towers and such that were implemented in different modules that weren't as prevalent in the older level 2 maps. So what they've done now is focused more on that verticality style of gameplay and offered both escape routes and engagement routes for solo players to be able to pick and choose what type of engagements they have and possibly be able to escape. This way, if you have a 3-man party that's just steamrolling everything, they have to kind of commit themselves to chasing down that solo player, and there's a lot more terrain and parkour style stuff that you'll be able to do in order to be able to evade those people. Basically making the squad have to pot commit in order to get you, if they're going to do that, or maybe they just leave you alone because you took off. Insofar as the monster spawns themselves, Terry went into detail about how the layout of each one of the rooms was something where combat with the monsters was unavoidable. So the way that they are constructing these now is that you will, if you need to, be able to avoid some of that combat. It won't be the case in every map or in every module, but there will be the ability to avoid that stuff more often than you had been able to in the past. He also said that they're looking at editing the monster density, meaning that they have like dials and such that they can play with the spawns for those monsters. They want to tone down the monster variety or the monster counts just a skosh, but there will still be some very high density monster, high stress areas. The idea being more akin to what we're used to seeing in games like PUBG or Tarkov, where you have these high spikes of intensity and really hard hitting gameplay, high stress, and then you have this drop off where that high stress ends and you are either dead or you have a lull where you can repair and kind of reorder yourselves, get ready for the next engagement. I guess the real main idea here is to try and make more of a dungeon crawl feel the priority as opposed to it being nonstop action or 15 seconds on a map and you're dead. The other thing that they wanted to try and do and things that they're trying to play with here is while the maps themselves are not necessarily procedural, what they're trying to do is reshuffle things a bit. So for the 5x5 map grids that we're going to see this next playtest, all of that stuff has been shuffled. The map is not going to be what we had been used to seeing before. Also, with the addition of these new pathways, it's very likely that the level 2 maps are going to feel completely different. Now, insofar as the Hell difficulty map, that map has not changed, unless they said that they might be able to end up crunching something between now and when the playtest releases over the next week, but they're not going to push it, and it's likely that we'll see just the Hell map be the same as what it had been before. Speaking of Inferno, the way that the Inferno map, the Hell map, the level 3, is being played right now is it feels like it's a PvE experience. You go in and you just end up having a lot of free loot. You kill whatever you need to get to a treasure chest room, or if you're geared up enough, you try and kill the boss. That they are looking at changing, but not for this playtest. The ideal that Terry said is that he wants there to be about 9 players on average on the Hell map. There shouldn't really be just one team or a player or a duo that is running there trying to just accumulate loot on a free run. And there's a bunch of different ideas that they have been floating for something like this, like portal counts and when they show up and whatnot. And obviously, relying on players with a 16-player count and having half of those players survive is not likely a viable scenario, especially considering that the portals don't show up until somewhere near the end of the round. In this case, what he has been floating is the idea of having multiple servers, multiple game instances condensing into one. He actually said that this would save them a considerable amount of cost in server hosting costs, because instead of each game having to spawn a hell level for every instance that gets played, now you're condensing 2 or 3 or 4 instances of the game on these servers into a single one for the hell difficulty. That will not likely be in this playtest, but it will likely be in the next one that comes up. This was an idea that had been floated originally with the level 1 style of difficulty. So we don't have a level 1 yet, as I said before, but the issue was going to be, depending on the lobby size, you have to condense that down into a level 2 and then into a level 3. So the most likely scenario that I see here is that this multiple lobby consolidation into the next and then the next level, into level 2 and level 3 from multiple separate sources is likely going to be the way that it goes. Now on to one of the big ones, the High Roller Dungeon Experiment. When they went back and analyzed all of the gameplay and the statistics that they were seeing, they noticed that there was a bit of a split. You would have guys that were in teams of super high sweats with really good gear that were just steamrolling entire lobbies, had everyone and everything on farm, and that was mixed up with guys that were either learning or playing more casually or just didn't have the stuff. The difference here is that all of the loot was still located on all of these normal level difficulty maps. So level 2 and level 3 were just intermixed with everyone, and then you would have guys that would kind of get ahead and end up in this upper 1% of powerfulness, and then everyone else. So what they've decided to do is split some things up. In addition to the high roller mode, which I'll talk about in a second, they've also added another tier of loot, but it's not a high tier, it's an intermediate one. Rather than having gray and white and then jump to blue, they're now introducing greens, and they've also modified the stat allocations a bit. Depending on the armor type, if it's class specific, it will more than likely have a stat point. The baseline stat allocations will be something that is tailored toward a specific class. For example, Marauder armor, which is for rogues, will end up having dexterity, agility, whichever one of the stats it is. It will end up having an agility stat tied to it so that it fits the rogue class. That will be a green quality item. Beginning with green quality items, they will end up having stat points. So that will have 1 affix, which is the stat points at green quality. Normal level difficulty maps will be cut off at blue quality gear. So blue quality gear will have 2 affixes, stat points, and then something else. Epic or purple will end up having 3. Legendary will have 4, and then artifact, which is like the light blue color, will end up having 5. So there's going to be a different stat allocation than what we're used to seeing. The high roller difficulty is a separate game mode of difficulty. So it will still be level 2 and level 3, but the mobs on them are going to be harder. At normal difficulty, if we go into level 2 and then level 3, on level 2, they have mobs that mostly have blue eyes, for instance, in the case of the skeletons. And then every once in a while, you would see a red eyes difficulty, which would be harder hitting and have more hit points. On the hell difficulty, if you go down a level to level 3 into hell, inferno, whatever you want to call it, those mobs are all red eyes. They all have red eyes. And then obviously there's some boss mobs. In the high roller difficulty, there's a fee for entry of about 100 to 150 gold. They haven't really decided yet, and this is obviously something that they'll likely end up playing with more as time goes on and as people amass more and more wealth. That higher level of difficulty, the baseline enemy will be a red eyes enemy. So it will be like the Inferno level of normal difficulty, but on the level 2 map. Okay, you with me so far? I know that this sounds a little bit confusing. It's hard to explain. Red eyes difficulty on high roller baseline. You also have the chance on level 2 in high roller to get another level of mob difficulty, something even harder. Something, instead of a skeleton having the brownish bones and then the red eyes, it will instead have very dark bones, and it will be like a black skeleton or dark gray skeleton that will have even more hit points and hit even harder. The loot on this map and then the Inferno difficulty maps will also be augmented. So legendary items, the orange ones that they refer to as unique. The only way to get one of those on normal difficulty is to kill the boss in Inferno. That's the only way that you'll see a legendary at all, according to Terry. There's the possibility of getting epics out of chests, but the only way that you'll find a legendary drop on normal difficulty is by killing the boss. That has been modified. It used to be you had an opportunity to get legendaries out of chests before now on the normal difficulty maps. That has been changed. You can't do that anymore. If you want to be able to get legendaries reliably, you have to go to High Roller. Artifacts will not be seen unless you kill a boss on High Roller, which obviously are going to have even more augmented stats than what we had been seeing up until this point. Now, I know what you're thinking. An entry fee of 100 to 150 gold doesn't sound like it's all that much, but they've modified how quickly we're able to earn gold. The money is starting to be slowed down. As time progresses between now and release, which is in Q2 of 2023, by the way, this is going to be slowed even more significantly. Money is going to start to be harder and harder to get, which means there's going to be more of a reliance on survival than what we had been seeing previously, and it also means that 100 to 150 gold might not necessarily be all of that easy to obtain either. What Terry said is that for the last playtest, because they figured it was only going to be 3 days and it ended up being 5, they ramped the gold rate of generation way up, and that's going to be reduced over time. They're going to ratchet that down moving forward. So that's everything related to High Roller. Super Sweat, we'll see what the fee is like. We'll see if it gets modified or adjusted, and I personally look really forward to playing that. I think it's going to be great. Now, on to the update for spells. Wizards and clerics are getting new spells and a new type of mechanic when it comes to memorizing them. There was also mention here of the skill trees, which we know aren't in the game yet. He said that they're about 90% of the way done. They want to implement the skill tree, but they want to make sure that it works right and it has a relative amount of balance before they give it to us. But this is going to play into those skill trees. So in this mage update, they're going to try and make the cleric and the wizard as diverse to play as they possibly can. And he also said that at some point in the future, they're going to add some spells for the ranger to use as well, like nature magic, but they're not sure exactly when that's going to happen. In this case, we're seeing a bunch of new spells being added for the wizard. He didn't give me specifics on exactly how many, but he did say that the cleric is also getting 2 new ones. Now, if you're a wizard or a cleric, you still need to have the memorized talent. That perk is still going to have to be allocated on your bar, that skill. In addition to that, if you're a wizard, you're probably still going to want to have meditate, although there is something with that they're looking to add later on that I'll get into in a second. The perks and skill tabs for all classes have also been consolidated, so there isn't going to be separate tabs that you have to navigate through, making it feel pretty clunky. They're going to all have that stuff kind of on the same screen, so it's easier to navigate. And the ability to swap in and out of those skills that mages have on those skill wheels is going to be something that you're going to do graphically in the UI. The way that they're going to do it is what I said was akin to how Dark Souls works, where you have a certain amount of memory slots that is tied to your memory skill. So in Dark Souls, you have this memory ability, a mind trait or whatever that you can modify, and that will allow you to remember more spells. But those spells have a finite number of casts, right? It's the same type of system here. So each spell that you're going to be able to choose from has a cost, like a certain number of memory-related points. This is going to be directly tied to the knowledge stat, which is also being added for this playtest. So knowledge is no longer useless. We now have a purpose for it, and that is being able to memorize a larger bank of spell options. These spell options go on the wheel, and each spell has its own memory or knowledge-based cost. So you have the option, for instance, to choose 2 or 3 really large nukes that do more damage than others, or you can take some utility and maybe 1 large nuke instead, giving you the ability to mix and match as to whether or not you're going to be more support-oriented or whether or not you're just going to try and be a nuke machine. For example, what they gave me was this one example of a lightning strike spell that the wizard is going to get. So now wizards are going to be more on the line of elementalists, where not only do we have fireball and magic missile, but we're also being given a lightning spell. We're also being given ice and water related spells to be able to mess with people. So very, very cool style of update. And the way that Terry explained this is that that spell needs to be tweaked because right now that lightning strike spell is kind of overpowered. It's more OP than if you were to strike someone with a fireball at point blank range. She said if you strike someone with a lightning strike spell at point blank range, you're going to not only kill them, but you're going to kill yourself pretty much instantly, and that it needs to be fixed. So I thought that was interesting. I did ask a question about resistances, and he said that there's going to be a modification to how armor works in this playtest, where armor will actually have magic resist associated with it, either as a buff to magic resist or a debuff, depending on what it is that you're wearing and what what it's made of. Like plate armor, for instance, might have a debuff associated with it for magic style of damage or nature style damage or lightning, but we're gonna check that when the playtest comes. He just said that there's going to be modifications to those stats on armor, either good or bad, depending on what it is that is on it. Again, more customizability. Insofar as spell debuffs and other buffs, like for instance, using a water spell to make somebody less resistant to a lightning hit, lightning doing bonus damage to somebody that's all wet, he said that they want to look into things like synergies, but that's obviously not going to be something that's in here right now. I did ask him about stats on armor pieces not making sense sometimes, and he said the randomness is more intended. They're not really looking to, at this point anyway, like kind of handpicking a lot of stats, because then they'd have to do it for like everything, and they don't want to get into all of that. They would rather let the RNG kind of do what it's doing, and then you end up having garbage pieces that you sell for gold, and kind of keeps the economy moving. Insofar as spells, I mentioned something about a change to how the spell wheel system works. Right now, for most mages, you need to keep meditate around unless you're going to bring a bunch of campfires, and most mages and clerics tend to not do that. In the case of clerics, you don't have meditate, you have to have a campfire, so you typically run with one and then set one down, or you have your party do it. Clerics are kind of made for a party style of system, whereas wizards can solo a little bit more viably, in my opinion, because you have the ability to use meditate. He did say, though, that in the future, they're going to look into having a skill as opposed to needing meditate, where instead you kind of have like memory 1 and memory 2, where you have 2 spell wheels instead of a single one, and you can kind of double memorize extra spells and then just use campfires to build those charges back up for party play, which I thought was very interesting. That ends up being something that raises, in my opinion, the skill ceiling and would make good wizards definitely separate from others. Speaking of wizards and clerics, we also have stuff with buff durations. So buff durations in a lot of cases feel like they're pretty short and they aren't all of that useful. Like wizard invisibility, for instance, only lasting a few seconds. Terry did say that the will stat, the stat for will that augments things like spell damage, also augments buff duration. So the more will you have, the longer your buffs will last, which is something that I think most people didn't realize. So there is the ability to be able to increase buff duration, but it's done through the will stat and other buff duration increase, I guess, affixes on armor. Insofar as in-game communication, they're looking at adding a chat feature for lobbies so that you can talk to the lobby, your own party, before you launch. So you could say things like, hey, get ready, ready up if you're playing with randoms, for instance. And for VoIP, that's not in the game yet. They're looking into it. They've basically put all signs to yes. They've greenlit the idea of putting VoIP into the game. They weren't sure if they were going to up until this point, but Terry said now everybody's on board. They have a lot of interest from the player base wanting VoIP in the game, so they are going to do it. So you heard it here first. VoIP is going to be in the game. Now, going into the playtest, they are also looking at the viability of making Dark and Darker a commercially viable product, which means things like cosmetics and a cosmetic store, etc. But they want to make sure that there isn't any form of pay to win associated with it. People that want the cosmetics can buy them, and if you don't. It's just a way for them to be able to monetize the game as a service. So for this playtest, they are also going to implement the ability to gain a skin. The skin is going to be something that you can achieve through doing whatever. They did not elaborate on what that's going to be, but you have to choose whether or not you're going to take the skin for the drip or whether or not you're going to take a negative stat point allocation. What do I mean? The skin forces you to have worse stats than if you didn't have it on. So rather than pay to win, they're actually giving us pay to lose for this playtest, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. However, Terry did mention that if the community seems to wholly reject the idea of a paid store, he doesn't want that to be in the game. He wants the community to be okay with whatever it is that they implement, and if the idea of having cosmetics in the game is something that gives players a tactical advantage, or if a skin is believed to give someone a tactical advantage in some way, he would rather omit them as opposed to include them for the sake of earning some extra dollars. The number one priority for them was to make sure that in no way would anything cosmetically related be justified or viewed as pay to win. I did ask him a question about potions and daggers glowing in the dark. If you haven't noticed, if you're a rogue, for instance, there is a bleed skill that makes your daggers glow purple in third person. You can see them in the dark, and obviously potions and whatnot on your belt also will glow in the dark. What I didn't realize is that rogues have an ability. They have a perk that's called Hidden Pockets that will hide those potions away. And this is one of those things that Terry said is intended limited and is a choice that you have to make if you're going to try and hide yourself. You need to make sure that you pull certain things off of your belt in order to be able to hide in the dark so that you can ambush people or orient your body in a way where those things are more hidden. Now, that's pretty much everything for this playtest. Now, looking beyond, we have things like the Bard class and then the roadmap and adventure points. So the Bard is further off than they had expected. They want to get a playtest soon for the Bard, but because the last playtest ended up going badly and felt rushed, they had the realization that rushing stuff between these playtests wasn't a good idea. So they're focusing more on the quality of gameplay and slowing it down a little bit for them internally to make sure that what they have added or will add ends up working as close to flawless as they possibly can and that everyone's happy with it. Bard was originally intended to be for this playtest, but it'll likely end up being pushed out to the next one or the one after that. The roadmap for the next playtest is to start cracking down on technical stuff instead. These last couple of playtests have been all more or less content focused. You know, there's been some mechanic changes, but for the most part, these playtests have been more content, more things to do, more spells, more stuff. That is being modified in the next playtest, whichever one comes after this December one, is going to be more technical. They're going to try and work on the netcode, make that as good as they possibly can, kind of fix things like the bow and arrow, where when you fire an arrow out of the bow, there is like a latency delay there when the arrow gets loosed, and it's kind of hard to track your target. You have to lead them a little bit more than you would normally. They're going to be working on that and polishing up what they've already got rather than adding more to it. Insofar as adventure points, that goes back to cosmetics. So as you're making achievements or adventuring through these dungeons, getting out, surviving, you have the ability to earn later on some type of adventure point system that will be tied directly to the XP that you earn. And this circles back to the whole thing where clerics right now aren't generating that much experience through healing their friends. The combat related skills for like rogues and rangers, those guys are leveling the fastest. You can level a rogue to level 20 in just a handful of hours. You can't do that with a cleric because they don't do a lot of damage. Usually they're backline healing and whatnot. So they're trying to work out a system where they're giving credit to the support classes for doing stuff for their party, but they don't want it abused where the cleric is just going to be able to hurt their friends and then heal them and get a boatload of XP for healing hit points. Whether or not the healing XP thing is in this patch, we don't know, but the adventure points system is going to be tied to XP generation, and they want to make sure that the XP generation across all characters or across all archetypes is fleshed out and more fair to be able to make that work for everyone, as opposed to, I guess, favoring the combat style of classes because they're the ones generating XP the fastest right now. That pretty much concludes everything for the playtest that I've got as I talked to Terry about it. But as you can see, there's an awful lot going into this one. A lot of new content, a lot of new ideas, a lot of stuff for us to be able to test, which is what we're here for. Once again, the playtest begins in the evening Eastern Standard Time on the 16th of December or the 17th in the morning early when they get into the office in Korea. So somewhere around probably 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time will be when it kicks off. It's going to run until the 21st, give or take, depending on whether or not they end up actually doing an extension or not, like they have done in previous playtests. My guess is they'll probably end up extending in another day or two, although I joke with Terry about it and he's hoping that they don't have to. But I'm stoked for this one. I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks so much for coming and checking me out. If you would be so kind as to follow me on my socials at OnePegMG on Twitter, at OnePeg on TikTok, and as always, follow me at twitch.tv/OnePeg, where I stream every day at 7 to 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you would be so kind as to please sub the channel here. We do this kind of stuff all the time, and I would love to have you back. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.